Okay, so now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Ifan Shepherd, who's a colleague of mine at Sept University, and he's going to basically, he's changed his title already, that's brilliant.
Of course.
He's probably going to talk about that stuff then, not this stuff.
In fact, the printed title has GPS in it. No, sorry, it's GIS, okay? It's something simple, but anyway. You'll see why I changed this in a moment. My father was a preacher, an evangelist, and all his life, one of the things he did regularly was to study the Bible. And because of that, he had a pen, a very special pen. It might have been a rotary, I'm not sure, but you filled it up with this magical substance, black substance called Indian ink. And I remember at the age of 7 suddenly commandeering this while he was away preaching. And I started drawing maps and colouring them in with blue and green and brown pencils. Now you can guess how long ago that was if I tell you one of the first maps I ever did was copied from the National Geographic, one of those pull-out maps. It's for a country called Siam. I say no more. Fast forward to the 1960s, and literally 100 metres around the corner here, I studied geography. And that's when I was introduced to my next set of maps, which is topographic maps of the world in map interpretation classes. And it was a mind-blowing experience. Fast forward again to the early 1980s when Steve and myself, what is now Middlesex University, carried out a year-long evaluation of AutoCAD for mapping purposes, 1982-83 if memory serves. And most recently, I graduated. I now work in a business school, not in a geography department or a cartography section or whatever, and I teach my MA Electronic Business and e-marketing students how to create map mashups. But that's the past, and my presentation today is about the future. Neocartography, neogeography, or, and maybe I should call this guy a neo-cartographer, because he's not a conventional cartographer or even a conventional neocartographer. He's actually a video game designer working in America. And what I want to try and do today is to suggest that he is actually a cartographer of a new breed, and I want to sort of take that theme and see where it leads over the next 25, 30 minutes. He's in a plush hotel. This is what video game designers get up to in their time off. Every year his company takes the entire 400 or 500 employees away for a cruise in the Caribbean, Costa Rica, 5-star hotels, which is where he is here with his partner Anna, and yes, she is a Russian blonde. Hawaii, in fact, I as next of kin was taken to Hawaii, all expenses paid, just 3 years ago. We're in the wrong profession, ex-cartographers or not. These are some of his mates, Jeep, Matt, Ido, Gaudam, and Dave. They're what I call GIS architects because they create three-dimensional animated or dynamic maps, but of course, better known as video games. Where did that take us? Well, it took my son and I 3 years ago to the point where we realized that there was this big convergence going on. Maps and GIS, representations, data models coming along here, modern video games coming along here, and they were converging at the rate of knots. So we wrote this up, we looked at their similarities, looked at their differences, we published in Hui and Mike's volume that you got here, and I think the word for me, or the phrase virtual geographical environment is stuck, and I like using it now as this sort of combination of the two kinds of artifacts. However, that's where my reference to neocartography as a product ends, because I want to shift our emphasis now away from data, away from the product, away from sourcing data, away from sharing it and disseminating it. I'd like to turn instead to the user. What is the user experience when they look at these new types of maps, the video game, and how could that possibly be a route map or a road map for a future for neocartography? That's the suggestions I want to throw out to you today. So I want to talk about, not the maps, but the way in which people experience the video games. And I'm coining a term, or I have coined a term called experiential engagement. This is where the video gamers are drawn into a compelling experience, which is really quite markedly contrasting with what the map and GIS users do with either their map product or their interactive screen-based product, where they have a deliberative or a very measured exploration and analysis. I've got a working definition here. I'm not going to dwell long on that because it is what it says. It is working. It's a work in progress. But let me take you along and ask, well, how do video gamers create these compelling experiences? What do they put into their maps, into their video games, their levels, or whatever you want to call them, that makes them so compelling, that gives the video gamer an experience that is so engaging? And these are some of the elements: realist environments, a first-person viewpoint. Well, let's go and have a look at some of them in a bit more detail. That's a very naive model because I want you to get out of your mind the idea that as long as you can assemble a set of attributes in your product, you're going to elicit a mode of engagement or a mode of use. That is very naive because you can drop most of these and you'll still get an engaging experience. And those that you think that might produce on their own an engaging experience actually might not. Let's look at 2 or 3 of them. Realistic environments. These are all from live video games, and it just shows how much they resemble maps or GIS models. I mean, there's really a paper-thin difference between the two nowadays. That was probably unfortunate. It came out, this particular version of the game came out about a week before Wayne Rooney's indiscretion, shall we put it, which was not very good marketing, but they stood with it. We carried out, when I say we, I'm part of a research consortium, a European research consortium funded by the European Commission, which I'll say a little bit more about later. And we looked at this issue of realism about 18 months ago. And we did a very detailed literature review. And we realized that visual or photorealistic realism is just one and perhaps a minority type of realism that video game designers actually use to build into their products. And yet they become compelling experiences. Now this made me think, well, hold on a minute, could the same thing apply to maps? And in a sense, the talk that we had a little bit earlier by Richard on OpenStreetMap is taking us in those directions. If it's good enough, in other words, quasi-realistic or almost realistic, then it can still be useful. Psychological realism, which is some of these other forms of realism, are actually very much more important. A second element or characteristic of these neo maps and these neocartographic products is that they change the point of view. We're used to the vertical point of view, the bird's eye view, the looking down view. More recently, the 2.5D surface looking obliquely. But of course, in video games, that oblique view becomes almost the norm, not quite, in 2 and 3D environments, or at ground level, we get the third-person view, where you're just somewhere behind your avatar, as in the skateboard game, or you're actually immersed in the scene in a first-person engagement, where that's all you see is the gun that you're shooting at the combatants. These are the ways in which maps are moving or morphing into different kinds of products with different grammars to them, different grammars of engagement. Emotional engagement. I guess the last quickie on psychogeography is heading us in this direction. We have to understand that while emotion is something we like to strip out of maps or traditionally have, and certainly out of GIS engagement, it's something that that video game designers always make sure that they get right. So that you can have the first and third person views. Sometimes they're used in a very strong way to elicit various kinds of emotional response by the player. But also sounds and lighting, as in Left 4 Dead here, also are very important elements. And I think I would just refer in a very glancing way to Descartes' Error, that famous book, Antonio Damasio, where he suggested that underpinning most cognitive abilities in our brain is actually the affective responses that we can make in the environment. And if you damage those affective responses, then your ability to plan and to take decisions is incredibly impaired. So there is a theoretical reason why we may want to re-engage the emotional, the affective, in our interaction with maps or neocartographic products. These new products, the virtual geographical environments, afford various types of behavior we don't find in conventional maps. Here are a whole variety of them: walking, running, climbing, skateboarding, and so on. And the environments, that is the video game environments, are actually specially constructed so they afford those opportunities. So if you walk up to a wall, you either stop or you start doing this and you climb up the wall. That's designed in, that ability is designed into the actual environment. And I don't want to go down that road because this is not a workshop, certainly not a workshop in video game design. But video games offer something else, which I think is very, very significant. They are responsive environments. Here, you as the player carry out an action on the virtual environment, and then the virtual environment reacts, and you then become entangled or caught up in this loop, which very frequently is a very rapid, fast-moving loop. And because it's reciprocal behavior, you as the gamer will actually learn about the environment through personal experience. But it's very action-oriented experience. But responsive environments actually has to be unpacked a little because it means two different things, two complementary things. First of all, you have to understand that in video games, you as the player actually through your interactions can modify the environment. You can break it up. And I don't mean actually switching to an editor. I mean in the game, you've now got destructible environments. not like a static GIS model or printed paper map. More importantly than that, the virtual geographical environment actually responds according to its own rules and agendas. Okay, this goes back to what I said a little bit earlier about having affordances built in, but also most video games have narratives or scenarios built in. It takes you along a storyline or a story arc. So we're some way beyond what maps and GIS models do, but I think here there are the germs of an idea of where we could be actually moving within neocartography. Let me now give you two very brief, less than a minute each, examples. The first is from the video game Just Cause 2. It shows a very mountainous environment. It takes a third-person viewpoint, so you can see yourself as the avatar in front of you. And it illustrates just navigation in that environment. And I want you to mentally contrast that with what you're used to with people navigating their way around a map or through a 2 or 3D GIS model. The second one is Half-Life 2. This switches to the first-person viewpoint, so you don't see your avatar, you're actually in the scene. And it's a combat game, so it's rather more frenetic, but it shows you, unlike Just Cause 2, a bit more about this emotional engagement. So let's start with...
So here I am at the rooftop of this skyscraper, over 600 meters or 2,000 feet above sea level. I'm going to start off with some free-roaming gameplay. I really want to get down to that military base below. So all I need to do now is take to the sky. Base jumping is something that you do a lot in the game. I think the record base jump in the office at the moment is just about 1,500 meters. So we'll see if you can beat that when the game comes out.
This is the game lead developer.
The parachute is really fun to control now. It's fully reusable and handles like a stunt parachute. And as you can see, I can use the grappling hook while parachuting to slingshot my way around. I want to use that boat over there to go to the military base, so I'll just steer this parachute towards it and then just quickly stunt jump directly to the boat.
Geography in action. The second one sorry for the high volume. It was deliberate because this is how players immerse themselves in these games, making sure they get that visceral engagement, this visceral interaction, this feeling of being in the scene and part of the action. What can we draw from this from neocartography, if anything? Well, clearly we're harnessing human behavior because people are doing things, they're acting and getting this fast response. This active interaction then encourages personal experience, it elicits some sense of perhaps being there. We're adopting a human perspective rather than more symbolic or abstract perspective that you might find on maps or other artifacts. And very clearly, we have this emotional response being brought to the surface. But just in case you think that engagement with video games is just fun or just entertainment, here's a very recent survey of some of these action and driving games, and they look particularly at the various cognitive and perceptual and sensory activities and abilities that the games are actually using. And if you were to match this against the kind of summary of abilities and capabilities you'd expect from students using maps or other users using maps, there's a huge degree of correspondence there. So in terms of what the user is doing and their abilities that they bring to bear in these engagements, they're not far away from our modern cartographic products. Which brings me, I guess, back to the title, or the revised title of this presentation. The first line here is meant to represent what we do when we handle maps, and we're going back several years perhaps. My childhood, my previous existence as a student and as a teacher of geography. Then along comes GIS. This refers to the role of our perceptual faculties, our cognitive faculties. This is very subjective. It's what I've suggested are the balances in our use of these particular abilities. And then finally, I want to bring us up to date and suggest that the video game actually provides another set of interactions, another way of engaging with this kind of world, or virtual world, where we actually prioritize our motor engagement, our affective engagement. It doesn't mean that our perceptual and cognitive faculties are put to one side. They're not. They're still there. But there's a different mix. So as you can see, there's a degree of complementarity here that I want to emphasize. Okay. Let's now go to the boring bit of this presentation, unless of course you feel it's boring already. Hopefully not. As an academic, I'm always challenged to define my terms. So when I propose a phrase, experiential engagement, I have to try and justify it. Are there already terms out there that describe what I'm talking about? Well, the answer is probably yes. Let's have a look at some of them. But first of all, what do we mean by experience? Once you get into trying to define experience, any of you have tried to do it, even the psychogeographers amongst you, it's a very difficult thing to pin down. I mean, it goes all the way back, I guess, to, well, even back to Immanuel Kant in the 1780s, 1790s. I suppose it's the fullest, most active kind of consciousness that includes feeling as well as thought. That's Raymond Williams in his famous keywords. And there are various philosophies, whether it's phenomenology or experiential realism, and I'm pretty much taken up with this, as we'll see perhaps a little bit later. Marketers, and I'm in a business school, so I see this from the inside. Marketers have really grabbed onto this notion of experience and how to use experiences to market products and services. And there are whole books and courses on experiential marketing. In other words, get away from the cognitive, get away from the purely perceptual and the selling of products through their characteristics and attributes. Forget that. Let's go for the experiential part of the appeal. Okay. Engagement, what does this mean? Well, we all know our sort of everyday understandings of the word. In business, where I work, it means two things. Initially attracting the customer and then holding on to them. There's a particular term used in website design. It's called stickiness. Once you've got somebody to visit your website, you have to design it to hold them there, just like a spider's web, basically. And there's a whole sort of sub-technology of designing for stickiness. And it's all part of this business of boosting engagement. And engagement itself has been brought into marketing and into business. Here are some modern recent textbooks. But of course, when you then start looking up the real encyclopedias for proper definitions, you find that they get awfully confused, or at least the people who subscribe to them or contribute to them get very confused. Engagement marketing is called sometimes experiential. I would beg to differ. Flow is another related term. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I'm sure you've all heard about it. Csikszentmihalyi, who came up with the idea about 15 or so years ago, referring to an optimal positive state that we engage in when we have these very emotive, embodied experiences. And it's been taken up and applied to video games. If you look here and measure the video game experience as being a contest between the video gamer's ability to play the game and the degree of challenge that the video game provides, then the optimum flow is the point at where there's a balance between the challenge of the game and the ability of the player to actually see it through to completion successfully. Okay? And of course, hardcore gamers prefer a greater challenge than their abilities permit, and novices the reverse. Other terms that are used that are very similar to experiential engagement are, and those of you who are into virtual reality will understand them, the idea of immersion, that your consciousness changes so that you're completely engaged within the experience of a game or some other virtual reality. And presence, which is a media-induced feeling of being somewhere else and actually not understanding that you are actually talking to or interacting with media. You're so engrossed. Now, experiential engagement, flow, immersion, presence, all these terms, if you start looking at how they relate to one another, you get awfully confused. I do, and I've done a complete literature review of this. Some suggest that they are related in this way, so there's an overlap between flow, immersion, and presence. Others say, no, it's flow, presence, and engagement that are interrelated. Mount, 2 or 3 years ago, suggested that actually immersion was the key concept, and it actually subsumed these other two. And then Brown and Cairns, when you go back to 2004, look at the paper, said no, engagement is the lowest form of immersion, and as you go up the ladder, actually what you want to really achieve is total immersion. So where does emotional experiential engagement actually fit in here? As if it matters, but I think it matters to get it right. I somehow see it at the middle of all these various types of constructs, a kind of a unifying approach. Benefits. The first benefit, only look at the green line, forget everything below it, because I think we already had a very, very nice explanation of this by Chris earlier, Chris Watson. Egocentric subjectivity, am I right, if I remember it rightly? Yeah? Thanks for that, because it says exactly what I have in mind here for the engagement you get in video games. It facilitates your person-centered view of the world rather than some abstracted and disembodied view of the world. Multi-sensory interaction. Somebody over here, I think they're no longer with us, asked the question about what about designing for people with various impairments or disabilities. Multi-sensory interaction allows people to balance their perhaps lower visual acuity against their oral capability, just for example. And so multi-sensory ways of representing the world, whether video games or map products, are a way of accommodating people who have different mixes of sensory abilities. If you love loud noises, for example, the Half-Life 2 kind of game is for you. If you don't, then maybe a more placid SimCity experience is probably the one you prefer. This is quite interesting because there's been, if you like, a humanistic turn in geography over the last 15, 20 years. And various people from Yu Fu Tuan onwards have talked about, let's think of geography as being around the idea of eliciting the sense of place rather than space, which is somewhat geometrical, and that takes us back to the quantitative revolution of the 60s and 70s. I've highlighted 3 words here which I think are incredibly useful for me because they help me to link geography and therefore cartography with the kind of experiential engagement I see in video games, which could be a way forward for cartography in the future. Actions, you've seen how actions are embedded in most video games. Places, the worlds in which the video game actions are embedded, and the experiences are all what we would see as being part of our definition of a sense of place. So I would see video games, if you want to sort of diagrammatize it in some crude way, you take the various elements that build engagement, use the user, then have certain experiences which hopefully will then develop a sense of place, but it's by virtual means rather than going out on a field course, for example, which, as you know, is so expensive we can no longer afford to do it, or so they say. Yes, but isn't place far too subjective? 2 opposing views. One is David Lowenthal. Personal milieu, the things that go on in our heads, our mental maps and so on, all rather unique, all rather subjective. How can we compare them? And Lakoff and Johnson, who developed this theory or model of experiential realism, said, no, we all have various sensory apparatus or apparatuses that allow us as human beings to more or less perceive the world in ways that are roughly similar to one another and actually translatable. Obviously, culture often gets in the way, and language and so on. But they suggest that actually not all these experiential engagements are actually entirely subjective and entirely personal, entirely unique to the individual, so we can actually share them. Finally, let me just show you how in one project I'm involved in at the moment, we're actually building experiential engagement into a virtual environment that is meant for use by international emergency managers to enhance their training. It's called the Crisis Project. It's funded by the European Commission over 3 years. We're at the end of year 2. We're using a video game engine, the Unity game engine, to build a multi-sensory immersive 3D world where we design environments that show you particular types of emergencies. It could be an oil fire, it could be a car crash, it could be a rail crash, or any of these. The problem is that when you try and ask what is the most effective form of training in these environments, then clearly the live exercise is, I guess, the one at the top of the list. And I was lucky enough to have a pass to go to a major exercise in Keflavik, Iceland, in May this year, where for a whole day we had about 450 people involved in this live exercise from all the services, ambulance, rescue, fire, etc. Hugely expensive. They can only afford to run it twice a year, and that's about it. Okay. This person, is a very cold day, spots somebody trying to keep their hands in their pocket, even though they're supposed to be dead or heavily wounded, while they're waiting to be rescued. This is the casualty centre. Everybody engaged in this, everybody involved in this training session is actually playing for real. There's no shortcuts, and for about 6 hours, they're intensely engaged and immersed in this experience. But as I say, it's very costly, and that's why desktop exercises based on airport maps, or maps of other scenes of accidents, are commonly used in between. But these tend to be rather, dinky toys or Meccano toys or whatever on a tabletop with people sort of arguing, no, you should put it there and push it there and moving things around. The non-digital version of pushing tin, for example. What we're trying to do with the Crisis Project is to provide virtual reality type training that can be used by individuals or teams at any point through their career at very, very low cost, and certainly a tiny fraction of the cost of real training and real live exercises. Very quickly, we have two types of view. Those for the commanders and those for the on-scene first responders, the people who come across the accident first and try and do something, make sense of it. Well, we thought we'd have a semi-immersive view. This is our first mock-up. No, we thought let's get closer into the scene and create a more immersive view for the first responder. And that's where we moved. We've built in the complete day-night cycle, and we also seasons and weather and so on. And although this is taken from another game, we're building in the ability to triage people who are part of the accident, being injured. They may be moaning or groaning, lying down or whatever. And by various ways, you can work out what their main symptoms are. Okay. As far as the commanders are concerned, they don't need to be on scene and physically immersed, so we don't tend to use an immersive 3D environment. Instead, we did start by thinking, well, let's mock up a control tower as the command base. And then we thought, no, we want to be a little bit more synoptic, get more of a God's eye view, like some video games. And so we began with this vertical view of the virtual environment. And then we eventually moved to this kind of display for the on-scene commanders, where they would use a more conventional map. It could be OpenStreetMap, for example. In fact, I believe that might be, even though it's Reykjavik. And then you've got various screens that give you feeds into and out of other people who are responsible for managing the emergency. And these are the kind of goals that we have for engagement. And in fact, we're hoping that they will give us a far greater training effect compared to using more conventional ways of training. So finally, conclusions. Here, just come back to the original layout that suggests that we can possibly, or I would think we can add experiential engagement as a new form, an additional form of engagement with our neocartographic products, using video games as an exemplar. I see this as a complementary approach rather than an exclusive approach. And again, I think it was Chris again, wasn't it, who said that if you hold your tablet vertically and then switch it to horizontally, you go from the engaged view, the immersive view, the augmented reality view, or mixed reality as Americans like to call it now, to the conventional, synoptic, abstract, symbolic view of the map. To me, that again, and your 10 minutes was well worth it, honestly. That gives us a good example of how we can switch, or should be allowed to switch, between the two types of engagement that we've been used to, and this third type of engagement that we can then build in as a complementary way. Finally, just found this recently as I was reading Daniel Kahneman's book. Very interesting for all sorts of reasons. He talks about having two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and this is how we saw the relationship between the two. Odd as it may seem, I am my remembering self, and there are various chapters on why that's so. It's not just an anecdote. And the experiencing self, who actually does my living on a day-to-day basis, is like a stranger to me. What a weird thing to kind of say, but I think I understand what he means. And I think what the challenge I'd like to throw out to us as a community is, let's try making experiencing less of a stranger in our neocartographic lives. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, again, I'm going to allow one quick question whilst maybe Gary comes down and changes over. Yes, Richard, sorry.
I've been using Google Earth. There's lots of crossovers with what you're doing, and that switch from three-dimensional realistic view into a symbolised map view absolutely got making it as realistic as possible. most of my stuff is with teaching. It's absolutely. But I'm struck by Dalgano and Lee that talked about three-dimensional environments in education, and they did a review of all kinds of stuff, and they said mostly there was no sort of critique of the technique as a teaching term. You haven't really covered any sort of problems with what you've been talking about. One thing I found with people learn is when you say, okay, explore the area, you've got 6 degrees of freedom, and people, I teach school teachers, they absolutely struggle doing that. What kind of problems have you had kind of bringing a greater sense of reality to what you're doing?
2 very quick answers. One is about the sense of realism. Just going back to an earlier slide, we don't really need to have full realism or fidelity as people in training environments talk about. It's enough to have something that is plausible reality. That's a phrase that's now increasingly used. As for 3D, I was trained in map interpretation, and I still believe I'm a good map interpreter. But put me in a 3-dimensional geological map and I'm totally lost. All right? Put me in front of a 3D game and my son laughs out loud at me because I'm ham-fisted. So I find it difficult. And it's because of that we jointly wrote a chapter of a book just before that one on the overselling of 3D in computer graphics and in video games and in GIS and mapping. I'll give you the reference if you're interested. We've also written an article, a more technical article, on why people find it difficult to engage interactively with 3D video game environments and what techniques you can use to overcome those difficulties. Again, I'm quite happy to actually send you the paper. So I'll give you my card later and I'll send it to you. Okay? Quite a lot of work on it, but often it's hidden. Yeah?